The sky above Callow County had a way of lying. It would fill with clouds in the morning, great gray towers rolling in from the northwest, and every man and woman working the land below would look up with a cautious, hungry hope. By afternoon, those clouds would dissolve like salt in warm water, leaving nothing but a pale bleached dome of heat pressing down on the Kansas grass. It was a sky that made promises it never kept, and by the summer of 1887, most people in Granger's Ford had stopped looking up at all. Mabel Truitt had never been one to look away from things that frightened her. She looked up every morning. She watched the clouds build and scatter. She studied the way the meadowlarks behaved before a change in weather, the way the soil cracked along old fault lines when the moisture left it, the way her own small creek, a thin channel she called Harrow Run, shrank a little further back toward its source each week, like an animal retreating into its burrow. She watched all of it because information was the only currency she had left. Money had run out when her husband Gerald had gone into the ground 3 winters past, taken by a lung fever that moved through the county like a quiet, methodical thief. What he left her was 160 acres of marginal ground on the eastern edge of the county, a cabin with a good chimney and a bad roof, a well that ran shallow in summer, and a debt to the county land office that came due in 60 days. 160 acres of Kansas grass sounds like a fortune until you walk every foot of it. The western third of her land was good or close to it, a gentle roll of blue stem that held its color into July if the rain came right. The eastern third was a different story, thin soil over limestone shelf, good for nothing except goats and stubbornness. And the middle third was where Gerald had tried to put in his wheat field 2 years of backbreaking work that yielded one decent harvest and one catastrophic one. After the second year, the field had gone back to weeds and memory. Mabel had let it. She had too much to do and too little of everything else to fight a dead man's dreams. She was 42 years old. She looked 50 and felt 60 on cold mornings, when the hip she had broken in a fall from the loft 3 years back made itself known. Her hair had gone gray at the temples, early though she kept it pulled back so tight beneath her work bonnet that it barely showed. She was a narrow woman, not delicate, but economical, as if every ounce of her had been stripped down to the essential. She had eyes the color of creek water in autumn, neither blue nor green, but something between the two, and they had an unsettling quality of seeing past the surface of things. Men in town found this quality irritating in a woman. Women in town found it exhausting. Mabel had long since stopped worrying about either reaction. The town of Granger's Ford had 312 souls by the last census, and Mabel knew most of them in the way you know the people of a small town by the public version of themselves, the version they maintained in the street and at the mercantile and at the 2 churches that served the county's competing strains of Protestant conviction. She had lived in the county for 17 years, had come as Gerald Truitt's wife at 25, and in those 17 years she had watched the town do what small towns do, which is to say it had changed people's lives through the weight of its collective opinion in ways that were enormous and that no one in the town would have recognized as a form of power. Small towns do not see themselves as powerful. They see themselves as simply seeing clearly. They believe their judgments are observations rather than verdicts. This is the particular self-deception of communities, that their consensus is descriptive rather than prescriptive. That when they decide what a person is, they are merely recognizing a fact rather than creating one. Mabel had watched this operate on others for 17 years, and had then at Gerald's death found it operating on herself. A widow with marginal land was a known category in Granger's Ford. The category had its requirements. It required a certain humility, a visible acknowledgement of reduced circumstances, a deference to the men whose circumstances were less reduced. It required that you not make moves that were too large for your category, that your ambitions stay within the perimeter the community had drawn around you. It required above all that you accept the community's definition of what you were, which was manageable, sound, and temporary, until you either remarried or failed entirely and moved away. Mabel had not been accommodating about any of this. She had not been hostile either. She had simply continued to exist on her own terms, with the serene, slightly maddening indifference of a woman who has decided that other people's definitions of her are not worth the energy of argument. This had annoyed the community in the particular way that refusal to engage always annoys people who have invested in their own opinions. If she would not argue, they could not win. If she would not acknowledge their verdict, it could not be applied. And so they had settled into mockery, which is the last resort of people whose authority has been declined. Mockery does not require acknowledgement. It can happen behind someone's back at the stove in the back of a mercantile, in the particular kind of laugh that does not need its subject present. It had been going on for 2 years before the April morning with the calf, and it had achieved its intended purpose of making Mabel's life harder in the specific way of constant low-grade social friction without achieving its deeper purpose of making her into the person the town had decided she should be. She was not and had never been that person. She was Mabel Truitt, and she had been walking her east fence line in early April to check the wire, and she had seen the vultures circling, and she had made her decision in the way she always made decisions, without consultation and without the weight of other people's probable opinions, because she had learned a long time ago that those opinions would be wrong about the things that mattered, and that she did not have the time to wait for them to catch up. She had been alone for 3 years, and in that time she had learned the particular discipline of solitude, which is not the same thing as loneliness. Loneliness is a wound. Solitude, when you learn to work with it rather than against it, is a kind of sharpened attention. She noticed things other people walked past. She heard silences that had meaning. She had come to understand her 160 acres the way you understand a difficult person you have lived with long enough. Their moods, their resistances, the places where they give, and the places where they hold. She knew which corner of the blue stem pasture dried fastest in July, and which low place stayed green 2 weeks past everywhere else. She knew the 3 spots along the east fence where the soil smelled different in spring weather, and darker signs of underground water moving through channels she had not yet found. She had been finding her land like this slowly by paying attention, because she had no money to hire anyone who could tell her what she needed to know, and so she had to learn it herself. The 60-day notice from the county land office sat on her table every morning when she ate her breakfast. She had not thrown it away, and she had not hidden it. She looked at it. She let it remind her. $87.40, the remainder of 2 years of accumulated arrears on the property levy, due on the 1st of June. She had $31 in the flour tin. She had 3 laying hens who were reliable but not miraculous. She had a small kitchen garden that was coming up well, and she had the blue stem pasture which was not yet generating income because she had no animals to put on it. She had been thinking about the problem of the animals for months. A good milk cow cost money she did not have. A pair of draft animals was out of the question entirely. The small operations around her, the men who ran 5 or 10 head of cattle on marginal land, were not prospering either, and none of them had surplus stock to trade or spare. She had looked at the problem from every angle she could find, and every angle led back to the same wall. It was the 4th of April when the world changed. She was walking the east fence line where the wire had gone loose over winter, carrying a roll of new wire over one shoulder and a fence stretcher in her other hand. The grass was coming up that bright, almost violent green of early spring that looks like it is trying to make up for the gray months all at once. She could see the Driscoll land through the fence posts, the vast rolling pasture of Harlan Driscoll's ranch, where his Hereford cattle were moving in the slow, unhurried way of animals that have always had enough to eat. She heard the vultures before she saw them. That particular sound, that patient dry wings circling, was a sound she knew. Calving season produced its losses, and losses produce vultures as reliably as rain produced mud. She looked up and counted 7 of them riding a thermal above the far corner of Driscoll's calving pasture, and something in the concentrated intensity of their circling made her stop walking and simply watch. Through the gap between 2 fence posts, she could make out the edge of the calving ground, a flat, heavily grazed area near the windmill. The herd was moving off in a slow river of red and brown mothers nudging their strong new calves with their heads, the whole mass of animals flowing toward the water tank on the far side. But at the near corner of the field something lay still. A dark heap low to the ground, no bigger than a hound dog, unmoving, while the herd moved around it and then away. She watched. A wagon appeared from the direction of the ranch house. A good wagon with iron wheels pulled by a matched pair of bays that cost more than her annual land payment. Harlan Driscoll himself sat at the reins. She recognized him by his size and by the way he held himself, the particular upright heaviness of a man who has never been required to fold himself small for anyone. He drove the wagon to the dark shape in the grass and climbed down with the deliberate ease of a man in no particular hurry. He nudged the shape with the toe of his boot one sharp push. The shape moved, made a sound too weak to hear at distance, and was still again. Driscoll said something to his hired man, who had climbed down on the other side of the wagon. The hired man shrugged. Driscoll looked down at the calf, and even from that distance, even through the weathered fence posts of someone else's boundary line, Mabel could see the calculation in his posture, the brief consideration, the dismissal. He climbed back onto the wagon. The hired man followed. The wagon turned and drove back toward the ranch house. The calf was alone. Mabel stood for a long time. The vultures tightened their circle. The sun moved. She counted the minutes. 10, 20, the better part of an hour while the herd's dust settled and the calving pasture went back to its own quiet, and the 7 dark birds in the sky grew more deliberate in their patience. Then she moved. She did not give herself time to talk herself out of it. She had learned long ago that reason was the enemy of necessary action, that the sensible voice in her head was sometimes just the voice of other people's cowardice dressed up in her own vocabulary. She set down her wire and her fence stretcher, found the section of fence she had been planning to retighten, and instead worked it loose. She slipped through. She walked across Driscoll's calving ground, her feet loud in the cropped grass, and she knelt beside the calf. He was a bull calf black as creek waters at night, with a coat that should have been glossy, and was instead dull and staring. He was cold in the way that nothing alive should be cold in April. His eyes were half open, dark, and enormous, and when she put her hand on his neck, he moved just his head, a small lift and fall, as if the effort of acknowledging her had cost him something he barely had. On the flat of his forehead, above and between his eyes, was a small, perfect circle of white hair, the size of a silver dollar. "Well," she said, and her voice came out rusty from a week of not using it. "Aren't you something?" She got him under both arms, his hind legs dragging. He was heavier than he looked, and she staggered, getting him upright. She carried him back through the fence, the way she had come, one painful step at a time, and then half a mile down the slope to her cabin, where she laid him on the rough burlap sack she kept by the cold stove. Her arms shook, her back screamed. She ignored both. She had a fire going in 10 minutes and warm water in the pot in 20. She did not know precisely what she was doing. She knew cows. She had kept 2 dairy cows with Gerald and had nursed one through mastitis by following the instructions in the veterinary pamphlet the county extension office sent out every spring. She knew that a cold calf needed warmth first and everything else second. She dried him with an old grain sack, working steadily, methodically, while he lay with his eyes closed and made no sound. She did not let herself think about whether it would work. Thinking about whether things would work was a luxury for people who had other things to do with their time. She was still at it the next morning, trying to get the calf to take watered-down canned milk from a rag soaked in it when the shadow fell across her open doorway. She looked up. Arvid Brandt stood in the frame, all 71 years of him, wearing his good work coat and a look of severe, concentrated interest. He lived 2 miles west along the dry creek bed, a German immigrant who had been in Callow County since before most of the current residents had been born. He had a small, ferociously tended farm of 40 acres that produced more per square foot than any operation in the county because Arvid Brandt did not waste a thing. Not water, not soil, not effort, not words. He stood in the doorway for what felt like a full minute, looking at the calf, then at Mabel, then at the watered milk in the bowl. His face gave nothing away. He came inside without being invited, which was his custom, and knelt beside the calf with the careful, unhurried movement of a man who knew his knees would complain later and had decided not to care. He put one palm flat on the calf's rib cage and was still. "Driscoll's," he said. It was not a question. Mabel nodded. He looked at the milk in the bowl. This will scour him, all the way through and out. She waited. She had learned that Arvid Brandt's silences were not empty. "Egg," he said. "1. Good fat in it. A little lard. Molasses 1 spoon. In warm water." He paused. "Old recipe. From my mother's mother. The old women kept more cattle alive than any man with a ledger." He looked at her over the calf's back. They saw things the men were too proud to see. He stayed while she assembled the mixture from what she had. He showed her how to wet her 2 fingers and let the calf suck them, teaching the animal the motion before introducing the bowl. And the calf, who had refused everything else, took to it. Slowly, then with gathering urgency, then with a desperation that was its own kind of hope. When Arvid stood to go, the calf had taken down nearly a full bowl and had stopped shivering. At the door, Arvid paused. He looked back at the calf, and something moved in his face that was not quite a smile but was in the family of one. "That animal's mother," he said. "I have seen her. Driscoll bought her out of a shipment from Aberdeen in Scotland. He paid $800 for her and told no one. She was the best of the lot." He let that land. "He will tell you the calf is a runt. He will say the blood is thin. He will be wrong." He walked out. Mabel looked down at the calf on the burlap. $800. From Aberdeen, Scotland. She looked at the small white circle on the calf's forehead, the color of clean snow, and felt something shift in her chest that was not quite hope, because hope felt too fragile for what she needed right now. It was more like resolution, a thing that sets like concrete. The next morning, she went into Granger's Ford for flour salt and lamp oil. She needed those things, and she went in needing them, which meant she could not afford to turn around and go home. When Jed Carlo at the Mercantile leaned on his counter and said with a particular pleasure some men take in other people's misfortune, "Heard you've taken up veterinary work out there, Mabel?" The three men sitting around the cold stove in the corner did not laugh openly. They smiled into their coffee cups, which was worse. Mabel set her items on the counter. She waited while Jed figured the total with his pencil stub. She counted out her coins precisely the way a person counts money when there is not much of it, making sure every cent was right the first time, so she would not have to ask for it back. "That bull calf won't make it," Jed offered, dropping her coins into his register drawer without counting them. "Driscoll's leavings never do." Mabel said, lifting her sack. "You'd have done better with a laying hen," one of the men by the stove said to his coffee cup. Another man laughed a short, comfortable laugh, the laugh of someone who has found a joke at someone else's expense and feels no particular hurry to move past it. She walked out. Their sounds followed her into the street, not quite laughter, but close enough to serve the same purpose. She walked to her wagon, loaded her sack, and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap before picking up the reins. The coin she had spent on lamp oil had come from the envelope she kept in the flour tin, the one labeled in Gerald's handwriting, County Levy. That envelope was now thin enough to be worrying. She drove home. She checked the calf. He had moved himself slightly and was lying on his sternum instead of his side, which was progress of a kind that mattered. She did the arithmetic that night by candlelight, the calf breathing steadily at her feet. The cost of the eggs and the lard and the molasses and the extra milk. The 60 days on the county payment. The wire and the stretcher she had left in the field and would have to go back for. Then she looked at the calf, at the rise and fall of his ribs, at the white circle on his head like a brand placed there by someone else's hand. She blew out the candle and went to bed. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was brutal in its simplicity. Up before light, check the calf, start the fire warm, the mixture feed him. Then the regular work of the property, the fence, the garden, the chickens, the well. Then back to the calf at midday. Then the afternoon work. Then the calf again at evening. Then sleep light and listening, one ear always cocked toward the pen. She had read in a pamphlet she had kept from the county extension office the previous spring that a newborn calf requires feeding every 4 to 6 hours in the first 2 weeks of life. She had not kept to that schedule precisely partly because she could not afford to lose the work hours, and partly because the calf had shown early that he was capable of signaling his own hunger with a persistence that left little room for misunderstanding. He had a bellow that for an animal his size was genuinely impressive, a sound that had no business coming from something that had recently fit under one arm. He used it freely and without apology. Arvid came back on the 4th day and again on the 7th. He did not announce these visits. He simply appeared in the doorway, the way he appeared in the doorways of any farmstead in Callow County when he thought something needed his attention, with the unself-conscious authority of a man who has made himself genuinely useful in enough emergencies that his presence is always eventually welcome. On the 4th day, he adjusted the mixture, slightly adding a half teaspoon of salt that he said would help the animal hold his fluids. On the 7th day, he stayed for 2 hours and watched the calf move around the cabin, which was now his preferred territory when the weather prevented time outdoors. "He does not move like a sick animal," Arvid said. "He's not sick anymore," Mabel said. "No," Arvid said. He watched the calf investigate the leg of the table with his nose. "He moves like an animal that has decided to live." He paused. "That is a decision animals make. People too. It is not a given. She thought about that for a long time after he left. She thought about the moment she had knelt in Driscoll's field and put her hand on the calf's neck and felt him move. She wondered if she had been witnessing a decision or a reflex. She decided it did not matter. Whatever it was, the calf had made it, and she had been there to receive it, and here they both were. By the end of the second week, the calf had graduated from the burlap sack by the stove to a stall she built from salvaged lumber against the north wall of the cabin, where the chimney kept the air warmer than outside. He was eating grain by then, a coarse mix she ground herself and moistened slightly, and the mixture had been reduced to twice daily. He was still thin, still showing more rib than she would have liked, but the thinness was changing quality. It was becoming the leanness of something growing fast rather than the leanness of something failing. She named the date in her mind when he crossed the line, the 14th day. She had not been looking for the line specifically, but she recognized it when it passed. He came to her that morning for the first time, not because she was bringing food, not because she had opened the gate of his stall, but simply because she was there. He walked across the cabin and put his head against her hip and stood there. She looked down at the white circle on his forehead and understood that whatever had passed between them in that field had become something bilateral. The day Rufus Tate came to her fence was the 9th day after she had brought the calf home. Tate was Driscoll's foreman, a man made of the same materials as his employer, but in a more compressed and functional arrangement. He was not big, but he had a stillness about him that was worse than size, the stillness of a man who had learned that waiting costs nothing and intimidates most people without effort. He came on horseback alone in the middle of the afternoon when the light was hard and flat and cast no comfortable shadows. Mabel was reinforcing a fence post at the near edge of her property when she heard the horse and looked up. She kept working. She drove the next nail before she straightened and turned to face him. He did not dismount. That was deliberate. Men on horseback looked down at people on the ground, and Tate was the kind of man who cataloged these small advantages. "Mr. Driscoll's missing a calf," Tate said. His voice was neutral, and even the way a surveyor reads a measurement. "Is he?" Mabel said. "Black bull calf, about 10 days old now, I'd estimate." He looked past her toward the cabin. "Appears it wandered off the calving pasture." "Calves don't wander far when they're that young," Mabel said. A pause. "No," Tate said, "they don't." "So something else must have happened to it," Mabel said. "Coyotes maybe, or the birds." Another pause longer. "Mr. Driscoll would hate to think a neighbor had found that calf and didn't return it. That would be a legal matter." Mabel looked up at him. She kept her face entirely still. "If that calf had been found alive and returned to the Driscoll pasture, it would have died in the pasture. You left it for dead, Mr. Tate. I watched you leave it. I watched Mr. Driscoll himself leave it." She went back to her post. "If Mr. Driscoll wants to make that a legal matter, he is welcome to speak to the county office. I'll be interested to hear how he explains abandoning a live animal." Tate sat on his horse for another 30 seconds, which was long enough to establish that he was leaving by his own choice and not because she had dismissed him. Then he turned the horse and rode back the way he had come. Mabel drove the last nail and allowed herself one long, slow breath through her nose. Then she went inside and sat at her table and looked at the wall for 5 minutes, while her heart remembered how to beat at its normal speed. That evening, she drove the 3 miles to the county sheriff's office in town and asked to speak to Deputy Walt Osgood, who handled property matters when Sheriff Beale was away, which was often. Osgood was a lean, sand-haired man in his 30s who wore his authority the way some men wear a coat that does not quite fit with a self-conscious stiffness. He heard her out. He listened with the careful nodding attention of a man who has learned that appearing to listen is often sufficient. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at a spot above and behind her head. "The thing is, Mrs. Truitt," he said, "an animal on the range that's been left is a complicated legal question. There's the matter of intent. Did the owner intend to abandon the animal, or did he intend to retrieve it later?" "He drove away and did not come back for 9 days, Mabel said. "He may not have known exactly where it had wandered to. His foreman came to my fence and told me they knew exactly where it was." "Well," Osgood tapped his finger on his desk in a slow, thoughtful rhythm, "the law in this county on stray animals leans toward the original owner's rights. I'd be reluctant to put a formal property determination on this without knowing more of the facts." Mabel watched him. She had, in the course of 42 years, learned to read what men were saying and what they were actually saying, and they were not always the same thing. What Deputy Osgood was actually saying was that he would not help her. And the reason he would not help her was written in the careful way he avoided her eyes and in the name of the man who in Callow County owned enough land to make his preferences feel like gravity. If I were to lose that calf, she said, keeping her voice very even, to illness or injury or some other cause, would the county have a position on that, Sam? Osgood looked at her directly for the first time. She could see him measuring the question, turning it over. If an animal in your possession were to die of natural causes, he said slowly, that would be a different matter than misappropriation. I see, she said. Thank you for your time. She went home. She understood now the exact shape of the situation. She had no ally in law. What she had was a calf who was against all expectations still alive, and she had her own judgment, and she had the small, fierce privacy of a woman who had learned to be her own counsel. She sat with the calf that night for a long time, not working, just sitting. The calf was up on his legs now, unsteady, still but upright, and he regarded her from across the burlap sack with eyes that were clearing. His coat was beginning to dry properly, and she could see the underlying quality of it, black with a blue undertone, the kind of coat that in a few months would shine. She had no legal protection. She had a neighbor who had given her a recipe and left. She had 60 days before the county came for its levy. She had a dying calf who was no longer dying as fast as expected. And she had the absolute bone-deep certainty of a woman who has had everything she depended on taken away from her and survived the taking, that she was not going to let anyone take this too. She had one other resource that she did not speak about publicly, which was the accumulation of small observations she had made about Driscoll's operation over the previous 2 years. She had watched his calving pasture through the fence every spring with the attention of a woman who has nothing but time and reason to pay close attention. She had seen his herds decline not dramatically but steadily, the way a business declines when its management is confident rather than careful. She had seen the north pasture go from 40 head to 26 over 2 seasons. She had seen the east windmill standing idle for 6 weeks in late spring before someone came to repair it, which told her something about how closely Driscoll supervised his own operation. A man who does not supervise closely is a man who is managing an idea of himself rather than an actual enterprise. He has built the machinery of authority, the foreman, the hired men, the visible displays of scale and productivity, and he has come to believe that the machinery is the operation. But machinery requires maintenance, and maintenance requires attention. And Driscoll's attention had been, for as long as Mabel had been watching, directed outward rather than inward. He was interested in what the county thought of him. He was less interested in what his north pasture's carrying capacity said about the quality of his management. This was useful to know, not as ammunition, not yet, as context. A man who manages an idea of himself will, when challenged, defend the idea rather than the operation. He will reach for the levers of image, for the instruments of public opinion, for the tools that built his status in the first place. He will not look inward and quietly fix what is broken, because looking inward and quietly fixing what is broken is not how he became what he is. He became what he is by looking outward and making large visible gestures. Mabel's approach was the opposite of his, and this was partly strategy and partly nature. She did not make large visible gestures. She deepened wells. She built cisterns. She arranged for breeding services with her neighbors using a contract so modest that its terms were almost embarrassing. She kept records. She fed the calf. She watched. What she was building would not be visible for another year, possibly 2, but it would outlast what Driscoll was maintaining because it was built on what the land actually was rather than on what a man with money preferred it to be. Owen Calloway first appeared at her east fence line on a Wednesday, 11 days after the calf arrived. He was 11 years old with ears that stuck out slightly and the particular watchful stillness of a child who has learned that the world is more interesting when you don't announce yourself to it. He was Gareth Calloway's boy, the blacksmith's son, and he had his father's broad forehead and his mother's eyes, which had the quality of measuring things accurately without appearing to try. He did not announce himself. He simply stood at the fence with his hands on the top wire and watched the calf, who was now strong enough to walk the perimeter of the small pen behind the cabin, and had begun to develop an opinion about it. Mabel noticed him on the second day. On the third day, she said without looking up from the harness she was oiling, "You've got a good eye for livestock." "Is he going to be big?" the boy said. Already is compared to where he started. Owen was quiet for a moment. He looked at the white circle on the calf's forehead. Looks like a cinder, he said, like when the fire goes down and there's that one piece still glowing. Mabel looked up. She looked at the calf, at the white spot against the black. A cinder. Something that looked spent, but wasn't. That's his name then, she said. The name suited him in ways that went beyond color. There was something about Cinder that was always in the process of becoming, always suggesting a larger heat behind the surface. Calm the way the last piece of a fire holds its warmth longest and surrenders at last. He was an animal who seemed to be waiting for himself to arrive. Owen understood this without needing it explained. He was the kind of child who grasps the temperament of animals the way other children grasp mathematics, through some internal facility that bypasses conscious effort. He knew when Cinder was content, and when he was merely tolerating, when he was genuinely interested, and when he was performing interest out of social obligation. He adjusted himself accordingly with the fluid, unthinking ease of water finding its level. The two of them developed a language over those early weeks. It was not a language of commands, nothing so formal. It was a language of position and timing, of where Owen stood and when he moved and whether he offered his hand palm up or palm down. Cinder responded to these cues with a precision that was occasionally startling. He would follow Owen's hand signals at 15 feet, turning and stopping and moving forward on direction, not because he had been trained to, but because he was paying attention and Owen was worth paying attention to. Mabel watched this and kept her thoughts to herself. She had seen in her years of living with animals and with people that the relationship between a boy and an animal is one of the few forms of trust that does not need managing. You leave it alone. You make the conditions for it, and then you step back and let it be what it is. What complicated things was Gareth Calloway, who was not a man who stepped back from things easily. He was the blacksmith, the man who bent iron to his will for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and this professional habit had extended not without affection, but sometimes without flexibility into his approach to his son. He wanted Owen to be useful. He wanted him to be practical. He wanted him learning the trade that would keep him fed and housed and respected in any county in Kansas for the rest of his life. He did not in principle object to animals. He shod them all day, but he had the tradesman's instinctive distrust of attachment to things that could not pay their way. He came by the fence twice more in that period. The second time, Owen did not hear him coming because Owen was deep in conversation with Cinder about something Mabel could not hear from across the pen. She saw Gareth stand at the fence for a full 2 minutes watching his son and the calf, and his face was complicated in the way that fathers' faces are complicated when they see something in their children they did not plan for and are not sure how to address. He did not call Owen away that time. He watched for 2 minutes and then he walked back down the road the way he had come. Mabel thought that was probably a more important moment than it looked. Owen came every day after that, slipping through the fence with a naturalness that suggested he had measured the gap some time ago and found it acceptable. He hauled water and raked the pen and talked to Cinder in the low, steady murmur that some people use with animals and that animals always recognize as sincere. Mabel let him. She did not ask his father's permission because she had not offered for the boy to come, and it was not her place to give permission for things she had not arranged. She watched the boy with the animal. It was something to watch. Owen had the gift, rare and not teachable, of making an animal feel seen without feeling threatened. He would approach Cinder from the side, never head on, and he would let the calf come to him rather than pushing his attention. He talked constantly in that low murmur, not babble, but actual sentences, as if reporting the day's events to someone who had a right to know them. Within a week, Cinder was following Owen around the pen the way a dog follows its person, with the total unguarded devotion of an animal that has decided to trust. Gareth Calloway came to the fence one Sunday afternoon to collect his son, who was supposed to have been home an hour earlier. He stood on the roadside and watched Owen and Cinder moving together in the late afternoon light, and his face went through several expressions before settling on one that Mabel could not quite name. Not approval. Something more reluctant than approval. The recognition of a thing that is right even when inconvenient. "Owen," he said. The boy looked up. "Sorry, Pop, I lost track." Gareth looked at Mabel, who was sitting on the fence rail watching the same thing he was watching. He said nothing. He jerked his head toward the road, and Owen climbed through the fence, and they walked away together. Mabel heard Gareth say something low to the boy and Owen answer, and whatever was said seemed to settle the matter, because Owen came back the next day and the day after that. It was Doc Raymond Peel who broke the equilibrium. He arrived on a Thursday in late April, driving his own buggy, wearing his city coat, and the expression of a man conducting a professional errand while also conducting a personal negotiation with himself about the wisdom of it. He was the county veterinarian, self-appointed to a position the county had not created, but had come to rely on, and he had heard about the calf. He went over Cinder thoroughly, the kind of examination that takes 20 minutes, and says something about both the animal and the man doing the examining. He checked the joints, the eyes, the lung sounds, the growth plates. He looked at the hooves, which had a slight disorder from the hard start, and at the left front fetlock, where a small infection had developed from the damp ground. "That foot needs drawing and cleaning every day for a week," he said, more to his bag than to Mabel. "Salt poultice, then pine tar." He straightened. He looked at Cinder for a long moment. "Mrs. Truitt," he said carefully, "where did you say this animal came from?" "I didn't say," Mabel said. He looked at her. He was 50, with the face of a man who has spent a professional lifetime being the only person in the room who knew what was actually wrong and had grown tired of knowing it. "I'm going to give you my honest opinion," he said. "Not as a county professional, just as a man who knows cattle." He looked back at Cinder. "The bone structure on this animal is not what you see in Driscoll's Hereford line. It's not what you see in anything bred locally. The width of this chest at 3 weeks, the length of these cannon bones, the set of these shoulders. I have seen this once before in a show animal from Scotland a colleague of mine was evaluating in Wichita." He paused. "If this calf is what I think he might be, and if he grows into those bones, Mrs. Truitt, what you are standing next to right now will be worth more than your entire property." Mabel said nothing. Doc Peel picked up his bag. He moved to the door. He stopped. He turned back, and his expression had changed into something more uncomfortable than professional assessment. "I need you to understand something," he said. "I have a working relationship with Harlan Driscoll. He provides a significant portion of the county's veterinary business. If it became known that I had come out here and given you a positive assessment of this animal, I would not be able to continue operating in this county with his cooperation." He looked at his hands. "I am telling you what I see because I think you deserve to know it, but I cannot be seen to help you. If Driscoll asks whether I came here, I will have to say that I did and that the calf appeared to be in adequate health, nothing more." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry for it." He left. Mabel heard his buggy rolling away down the track. She turned back to Cinder, who was standing at the fence of his pen, looking at her with the patient, total attention that only very young animals and very old people manage to sustain. She knelt by the infected foot. She worked the poultice in with her thumb steady and careful. Outside, the April light was going gold on the fields. Her 60 days on the county levee were 51 now. She had no legal protection, a county official in Driscoll's pocket, a veterinarian who could not stand beside her in public, and a calf whose potential was apparently incalculable. She thought about what Doc Peel had said, worth more than your entire property. She thought about what Rufus Tate had said, a legal matter. She thought about what Deputy Osgood had not said, which amounted to the same thing. Then she thought about what Arvid Brandt had said: the old women kept more cattle alive than any man with a ledger. She pressed the poultice in patient and thorough, and she understood with the clarity that only comes at the end of a long chain of understanding that she was in a fight. Not the fight she had expected, not the simple fight of one woman against drought and poverty and loneliness. A real fight with a real opponent, one who had money and law and public opinion arranged on his side as carefully as a man arranges his tools before a day's work. She would need to be smarter than she had ever been. She would need to use what she had and what others overlooked. She would need to be, as she had always been, one person alone. But she was beginning to understand that being alone was not the same as being unarmed. Cinder moved his head and rested it briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of uncomplicated trust. Outside, the meadowlarks were starting their evening song. The sky above Callow County was its usual beautiful, indifferent blue. Mabel Truitt kept working. The first thing Mabel did when Rufus Tate rode away from her fence for the second time was count what she had. It was a habit she had developed with Gerald, who had been inclined toward optimism and needed someone to balance him. She had one healthy but not yet proven bull calf. She had a well that ran 20 feet down and was reliable through June. She had a seep at the northeast corner of her property, where the ground stayed damp along a line of willows, and she had been watching that seep for 3 years and knew it never fully dried. She had Arvid Brandt's knowledge and Owen Calloway's hands and Doc Peel's assessment, which she could not use in public, but carried like a stone in her pocket, solid and real. She had a county tax payment coming due in 48 days. She started digging the well deeper the following Monday, working in the cool of the morning before the heat settled. She dug by hand, standing inside the shaft and hauling dirt up in a bucket on a rope. It was the kind of work that ruins a body when done wrong and merely punishes it when done right. She did it right. 2 feet the first week, another 2 the following week. She hit a shelf of limestone at 24 feet that took 3 days to work around with a chisel bar. Below the limestone, the soil went damp and then wet, and then she struck water that ran sweeter and colder than anything the original well had ever offered. She lined the new section with flat stones and felt something in her chest release that she had not known was tightly held. The cistern at the seep took another 3 weeks. She dug a basin 6 feet across and 3 feet deep, lining it with clay. She dug from the creek bank, then a layer of flat limestone, then more clay. It was slow work because it had to be precise, and it was lonely work because there was no one to check it and no one to blame if it failed. By the time she finished, the basin held 400 gallons when full and lost perhaps 20 gallons a day to evaporation and seepage, which was a problem she addressed by cutting willow branches and weaving a rough cover that shaded the surface through the heat of the day. In those weeks, she also made her arrangement with the neighbors. There were 3 of them willing to listen: Hiram Cole, who ran a swayback Jersey on 12 acres to the south, a nervous little man with a large family and perpetually worried eyes; the widow Garman, whose husband's brother had left her a Hereford cow as the entirety of his estate and who had been trying to figure out what to do with the animal ever since; and old Pete Sutter, who had a black cow of uncertain ancestry that had proven difficult to breed and was generally considered more trouble than she was worth. These were not impressive animals. They were the livestock of people who had not been given the good ones. But they were females and Cinder was a bull, and the arithmetic of that was simple enough. She went to each of them in turn and laid out the proposition plainly. Pasture for their animals through the season, water guaranteed in exchange for the right to keep every other calf born. They would get their cow back in fall bred for the following spring, with the remaining calves to keep or sell as they chose. The offer was so unusual, so far outside the normal transactional vocabulary of the county, that all 3 of them stared at her for a long moment before responding. Hiram Cole asked if she was serious. The widow Garman asked what the catch was. Pete Sutter just looked at her and then looked out at his struggling black cow and said, "When do you want her?" By late June, Cinder had 4 cows to tend. He moved among them with a gravity that seemed to belong to an animal much older, as if he understood the weight of what was being asked of him and had decided to meet it. June and July passed in the compressed, breathless way that difficult seasons do each day, full to its edges and gone before you could inventory it. The borrowed cows settled into the rhythm of Mabel's property with the ease of animals that have found better grass and water than they were accustomed to, which was its own form of commentary on what they had come from. They grazed the blue stem with the deliberate thoroughness of long-deprived animals, and the blue stem, which had been cut back hard and then left to recover through 2 years of careful management, met them with a generosity that Mabel noted in her emerging ledger with the satisfaction of a woman who has played a long game correctly. Cinder conducted himself through all of this with a solemnity that Mabel sometimes found almost comical. He had the temperament of an animal who has decided that dignity is non-negotiable, who moves through his world with the measured deliberateness of something that knows it is significant without needing to be told so. He was never violent, never skittish, never unpredictable in the way of animals who have been improperly handled. Owen's months of patient, respectful attention had given him a relationship with people that was collaborative rather than managed. And the borrowed cows, initially cautious, had adjusted to his company with a speed that suggested they had made an accurate assessment and found the results satisfactory. The grass held. This was the thing that Mabel had not allowed herself to take for granted, that the blue stem pasture, which she had managed since Gerald's death, with a restraint that had seemed excessive in the first year and necessary by the second, held its color well past the point where every other pasture in the county had gone brown. She had not overgrazed. She had managed the load carefully, moving the animals to different sections On a rotation she had worked out by studying which areas recovered fastest and which showed strain. It was the kind of management that required patience and record keeping and an understanding that the land was not an inexhaustible resource, but a system that could be maintained or depleted depending on how you treated it. The men who drove past her fence in June and July and saw the green while their own pastures went to dust were not, she understood, looking at luck. They were looking at 5 years of management decisions, most of them made under financial stress and social pressure, and the conviction of people who knew better that she was doing it wrong. She had done it her way. The grass was her argument. She did not make this argument out loud. She did not need to. The grass made it for her daily in the language of color and height and the undeniable presence of animals that were not losing weight. Cinder grew through all of it. He grew with a steadiness that began to feel almost argumentative, as if he were aware of the case that was being made against him and was producing evidence in his own defense. By July, he was no longer a calf in any meaningful sense. He moved through the small pasture with a weight and deliberateness that was starting to attract attention from the road. Passing wagons slowed. Men who had things to do found reasons to take the longer way around if it went by Mabel's east fence. She was aware of the attention. She did not like it, but she understood it. A thing that should not exist and does anyway is always interesting. She put Cinder in the far corner of the pasture when she could and kept her fence line tight and her gate latched and her eyes open. The night of July the 14th, she woke to a sound, not a loud sound, not a crash or a cry. It was the absence of a sound she had not known she was hearing in her sleep until it stopped. Cinder's breathing, the low, steady rhythm of it that had become over the months as familiar as the sound of her own heartbeat. She lay in the dark for 2 seconds, listening to the silence, and then she was out of bed, her feet finding her boots by habit, her hand finding the lantern before she was fully awake. The cabin door was standing open. She had not left it open. She went through the door at a run and around the corner of the cabin to the pen. The gate of the pen was open, her lantern threw a circle of yellow light that felt completely inadequate. She stood in that circle and listened. From the north, from the direction of Harrow Run creek bed, she heard the sound. She had been afraid she would not hear a single low questioning bellow. She found him 40 yards beyond the open gate, standing at the edge of the creek bank, looking down at the dry stones below, with the expression of an animal that has surprised itself. He was unheard. He came to her when she called, walking back through the dark pasture with his head low and his breath making small clouds in the cooler night air. She put him back in the pen and latched the gate, and then she stood for a long time looking at the latch. It was a wooden peg latch, simple enough. It dropped into a notch and held reliably because it dropped by gravity. For it to have come open on its own, the gate would have had to lift slightly before swinging, which required the gate to move in 2 directions that worked against each other. It did not come open on its own. Someone had opened it. In the morning, she found the boot print. One boot partial at the soft ground inside her fence line, 20 feet from the pen gate. The heel had a distinctive wear pattern worn down on the inside edge. She looked at it for a long time, then covered it with a wooden board and weighted the board with a stone. She did not go to Deputy Osgood. She already knew what Osgood would do, which was nothing. Instead, she spent the following 2 days reinforcing the pen with a second layer of rails and replacing the wooden peg latch with a forged iron drop bar that required lifting and turning simultaneously, the kind of latch that made Arvid Brandt nod with approval when he came by that week for his customary wordless inspection of her progress. She also started sleeping lighter. She moved her cot to the side of the cabin nearest the pen. She kept her boots on the floor beside the cot where she could find them in the dark in the 2 seconds. She was not afraid exactly. She was alert in the way that prey animals are alert not with fear, but with the continuous low-grade attention of something that knows it is being watched and has decided to watch back. The drought that year was not a sudden catastrophe, but an accumulation, a long, dry sentence with no period in sight. July took the creek down to its bones, exposing the limestone shelf beneath that Mabel had looked at all her life, without thinking much about it. She thought about it now. She saw in the exposed rock the underground architecture of the county's water, the channels and shelves and tilts that determined where the wet season's water went when the dry season called it back. She studied it the way she studied everything now, as a problem that had a solution if you could see the right angle on it. The seep held. This was the thing that mattered. Even in the 3rd week of July, when the morning air carried the sweetish, acrid smell of distant grass, fires in the horizon to the north, had a permanent gray smudge that the men in town called smoke, but that Mabel recognized as the residue of an entire season's growth reduced to ash. Her cistern was still producing, not abundantly. The willow cover she had woven kept the evaporation manageable, and the seep itself fed by underground channels she could feel in the slight coolness of the soil at the northeast corner, when everything else was hot, continued its patient underground work. She thought often about the relationship between what you can see and what is actually happening. The surface of her land looked to a passing eye much like every other piece of land in Calhoun County. Dry, brown at the edges, struggling. But 6 inches below the surface near the old willow line, the world was different. 6 feet below her, well casing the world was entirely different. Most of what mattered was invisible to the casual observer, and most of what Mabel had built over the previous year was invisible too. The work of deepening the well was not visible. The painstaking construction of the cistern basin was not visible. The 3 months she had spent studying the seep line, mapping its behavior through seasons, was not visible. What was visible was a green pasture and a large bowl, and people looked at those things and thought they understood what they were seeing. They did not understand what they were seeing. They saw the result. They did not see the method. The first of the borrowed cows to show signs of her condition was Hiram Cole's Jersey, a philosophically patient animal named by Cole's children as Buttercup, which was a name Mabel did not use but acknowledged. The Jersey showed the classic signs of early pregnancy by late June, the slight softening around the hips, the change in temperament from merely resigned to actively contemplative, the way she positioned herself at the water trough with a deliberateness that had not been there before. Mabel noted this without comment and increased the Jersey's hay allowance slightly. The widow Garman's Hereford followed 3 weeks later. Then Pete Sutter's black cow, whose uncertain ancestry turned out to be less uncertain than Pete had believed, because the calf she was carrying showed every sign of being exactly what Cinder's Dam's bloodline promised. Mabel stayed up 2 nights in early August when the Jersey went into labor. She had attended enough calvings to know the difference between normal and not, but she had not attended a calving alone before. With Gerald, one of them would hold the cow's head and the other would work. Alone, she had to divide herself, which was a skill she had been developing in every other area of her life, and now had to apply in the particular physical urgency of an animal in difficulty. It was not difficult as it turned out. The Jersey was experienced, and the calf was positioned well, and the whole affair took 3 hours from the first serious contraction to the moment the calf stood on its own 4 legs and made its decision about the world. It was a heifer. She was black like cinder, with his same deep chest, and she stood in the lamplight on Mabel's straw with the slightly astonished expression of something discovering itself for the first time. Mabel sat back on her heels and looked at this new creature and felt something she did not have an immediate word for. Not triumph, though that was in it. Not relief, though that was in it too. It was something simpler and larger than either. She had made something possible that would not have been possible without her. The calf was alive because she had gotten up every morning for 4 months and done the work that kept Cinder alive and healthy and present. This heifer calf was the result of a chain of small decisions that she had made alone in silence against the derision of a town that knew better. She thought this is how things actually happen. Not in moments of revelation, not in confrontations or contracts or dramatic reversals. In mornings. In the patient, unseen accumulation of mornings, each one the same as the last and each one different from it, until one morning the work has become something you can stand in front of and see. She wiped down the calf with a grain sack and watched the Jersey attend to her daughter. And outside, the drought held its grip on the county, and the stars above Kansas gave their usual indifferent light to the whole enterprise. Nora Whitfield arrived on a Thursday in late July. Mabel knew Nora by reputation more than acquaintance. She was 28, a widow herself, her husband dead of a kicked horse 7 months back, leaving her with 40 acres of played-out pasture on the county road's south side and a bill at the Granger's Ford Mercantile that Jed Carlo was beginning to mention in conversations. She was a small, sharp-featured woman with dark hair and the particular kind of energy that comes from being too intelligent and not having enough to direct it at. She arrived at Mabel's gate on horseback, which was itself a statement, wearing clothes that were clean but had been mended so many times the mending had become the fabric. She looked at Cinder. She looked at the new fence rails and the iron latch. She looked at the cistern, which was holding well, and at the deep well casing, and at Mabel. And then she said with the brisk directness of a woman who has decided to stop pretending, I need work, real work, not charity. I know cattle, I'm not afraid of them, and I can put in a full day. What would you give me for it? Mabel looked at her for a moment. She thought about Nora's tone, which had something in it that was not quite rudeness, but was in the neighborhood. The tone of a woman who expected to be managed. I'd give you a third of what we bring in from the first calf sale, Mabel said, and your noon meal, if you stay through the calving. Nora's expression said that she had expected to negotiate and was mildly thrown by not having to. Fine, she said. She dismounted and tied her horse to the fence post and went to look at Cinder. And the first thing she did was step inside the pen and run her hands along his back with the practiced assurance of a woman who had handled cattle for years. Cinder turned his head and regarded her with his enormous dark eyes, and she stood her ground, which was the right thing to do. And after a moment, he went back to his thoughts. He's extraordinary, she said quietly. And for a moment, she sounded nothing like the woman who had arrived at the gate. For the next 2 weeks, Nora came every morning and left before dark. She was not easy company. She had opinions about how things should be done, and she stated them, and 2 of her opinions were correct, and 1 was wrong, and they had a brief, pointed argument about the wrong one in which Mabel laid out the reasoning, and Nora was quiet for a long moment and then said, all right, without any additional drama which Mabel found she respected. There was a day in early August, hot enough that the air over the pasture shimmered, when they were both working the fence line at the far end of the property, and Nora's hammer slipped, and she caught the top rail with the heel of her hand and left a deep gash. She did not make a sound. She wrapped her hand in the hem of her shirt and kept working, and Mabel watched this and recognized it as a woman who had decided that showing pain was showing weakness and had made that decision so long ago, it was no longer a decision but a reflex. Mabel brought her water and bandaging from the cabin without comment. They did not discuss it. But something shifted between them, and after that, the way the air shifts after lightning, charged and altered, and somehow cleaner. Owen came every evening, and the 3 of them moved around each other in a way that had no name, but was its own kind of family, temporary and accidental and real. The Hereford cows' calving came in the 3rd week of August, and it was harder than the Jerseys had been. The calf's front legs folded back in a presentation that would have killed both animals if left to proceed. Mabel had read about this in the pamphlets she had collected from the extension office and in the pages of Arvid's old German agricultural manual, which she had borrowed and read 3 times through. Reading about a thing and doing a thing are different countries, but the reading gave her a map and she followed it. Nora held the cow's head and talked to her in the low, steady voice she had developed for exactly this kind of situation. Mabel worked by lantern light in the close hot air of the barn, patient and methodical, repositioning the calf's legs one at a time. It took an hour. At the end of the hour, there was a calf on the straw that had not been there before, a solid red-coated animal with his father's brow bewildered by his own existence. Nora was sitting against the barn wall when it was done, her back to the boards, her knees up. Her face in the lantern light held something Mabel had not seen there before. Not the brisk competence of a woman managing her day. Something quieter and more open. I didn't think you'd be able to do that, Nora said. Neither did I, Mabel said. They looked at the calf. He was trying to stand. He fell twice and stood on the 3rd attempt, which is the usual number, and the cow turned to him with the focused attention of an animal returning to her purpose. Nora laughed a short, unexpected sound. Mabel found herself laughing too, the kind of laughter that comes after sustained fear, releases genuine and involuntary and not particularly dignified. They sat in the barn until the calf was steady on his feet and nursing the night insects singing outside the drought, pressing down on the county like a thumb. But in the small circle of lantern light, something had survived that was supposed to have not. Deputy Walt Osgood arrived on a morning in early August with a folded paper in his hand and the expression of a man who is performing a duty he finds personally regrettable. Mabel was cleaning the cistern filter, her hands wet and her patience already shortened by 2 nights of poor sleep. She straightened when she heard the horse and wiped her hands on her work apron and waited. Osgood dismounted. He handed her the paper without preamble. County Water Rights Assessment, he said. Under the Kansas Territorial Groundwater Ordinance of 1875, subsurface water that originates on adjacent property may require an easement claim if it migrates. Mr. Driscoll's counsel has submitted a notice of inquiry. Mabel unfolded the paper. She read it. It was 4 paragraphs of precise legal language that arrived eventually at a threat. Driscoll was claiming that the water in her cistern seep originated on his property based on the subsurface geology and was therefore subject to his rights. This means he wants my cistern water, she said. It means the county would need to assess the situation, Osgood said carefully. He found out about the cistern. I'm not able to speak to how the inquiry originated. She folded the paper carefully. She looked at Osgood, and he looked at a point somewhere beside her left ear. How long do I have to respond? 30 days. He mounted his horse and rode out. Nora, who had been working the far side of the pen within earshot, came to the fence. She said nothing. She held out her hand for the paper and Mabel gave it to her. Nora read it twice. He's going to take your water, she said. He's going to try, Mabel said. That evening, she drove to Arvid Brandt's farm. She brought the paper and spread it on his kitchen table. He put on his reading glasses, the wire-framed ones with one bent arm, and read it with the slow, concentrated attention of a man who treats written words as deserving of respect. When he finished, he looked at her over the frames. The ordinance he is citing, Arvid said slowly, there is a provision, Section 11, water sources on individual homestead claims that were established by manual labor, meaning dug by hand, improved by hand, may be claimed as proprietary improvements regardless of the source water's origin. He tapped the paper. This was put in so that sodbusters who improved their land did not lose their work to the railroads. It has not been used much, but it is there. How do you know this? He gave her a look that was as close as Arvid Brandt ever came to reproach. I have been on this land for 31 years, he said. I have read everything. She wrote the letter herself that night, citing Section 11 of the ordinance, noting the date she had begun the cistern improvements and the nature of the manual labor involved. She wrote it in her best hand, precise and formal. Arvid read it, made 2 small corrections to her legal phrasing, and signed as witness. She mailed it to the county office the next morning. She did not hear back for 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were the longest of the summer. It was in that waiting period that Edmund Carver arrived. He came from Denver, which explained his suit and his accent, and his general air of having operated in a larger world for long enough that the dust of Calhoun County struck him as charming rather than suffocating. He drove his own buggy, and he drove it well, which told her something. He had a card that said Edmund Carver Livestock Acquisition, Denver, Colorado, and he held it out to her at the gate with the practiced confidence of a man who has never had a card rejected. He had heard about Cinder. He was cagey about how, but Mabel suspected Arvid, who had a habit of corresponding with people she did not know, and would tell her about it only after the fact. Carver walked around Cinder for a full 10 minutes without speaking. He examined the calves, who were now growing in the small secondary pen she had added that month, the first 3 calves Cinder had sired on the borrowed cows. He checked them with the thorough, efficient manner of a man who has evaluated several thousand animals and knows what he is looking for. When he stood up from examining the smallest calf, his suit dusty at the knees, his expression had changed from professional to something raw. Mrs. Truitt, he said, and he was clearly working to keep his voice at a conversational register and not quite succeeding. Who told you this animal's lineage? I formed my own view, Mabel said. He looked at her steadily for a moment. The conformation on these calves, he said. The width, the bone density, the temperament. I have bought and sold cattle in 6 states, and I have seen this combination twice. Once at a show in Scotland. He paused. And once here in a Driscoll Ranch sale manifest, where a breeding record listed a Scottish Highland import dam that died in her 2nd season. He looked at her. He told the county it was a respiratory death. He never mentioned there was a surviving calf. The air between them was very still. A meadowlark sang from the fence post and stopped. He knew, Mabel said. He has known since April, Carver said. He knew what he left in that field. What he did not know was that anyone would take it. He looked at Cinder. I will offer you $300 for the bull calf from the Jersey cow, right now. That calf is not mine to sell. He belongs to my neighbor under our arrangement. Carver nodded slowly. He pulled out a small leather notebook and wrote something in it. Then I want to be on your list for the next available animal. And I want you to know that when you are ready to discuss Cinder's stud arrangements, I represent buyers who will make it worth your while to talk. He looked at her directly. "You have built something here, Mrs. Truitt, that Harlan Driscoll cannot build because it requires a quality he does not possess." "What quality is that?" she said. "Patience," he said, "and the willingness to let a thing be what it is instead of what you want it to be." He left her his card and his word, and both proved in time to be worth having. The days between Carver's visit and Driscoll's arrival were the strangest of the summer. Something had shifted in the county's attention the way the air shifts before a weather change, a pressure that has no visible cause, but that the body feels and responds to. Mabel felt it every time she drove the wagon to town for supplies, in the way conversation stopped when she entered a room and resumed when she left, not with the dismissive scorn of before, but with something that had no clean name. Interest, calculation, a reassessment in progress. Jed Carlo at the Mercantile was the first to change his manner openly. He had always been polite in the minimal way of a shopkeeper who depends on all his customers. But now there was an additional attentiveness, a slight leaning forward when she spoke, an eagerness to show her the quality of his dried goods that had not been there when she was just the foolish widow with the runt bull. She noticed and said nothing. She bought what she needed and left. The men who had laughed at her by the stove were not there on her next two visits. She did not know whether this meant they had stopped coming to the Mercantile or had chosen different hours, but the absence was conspicuous, and she filed it away. What she was filing more broadly was everything. She had always done this, the accumulation of observed facts that most people let slip away because they could not see an immediate use for them. She filed the way men looked at her now versus before. She filed Driscoll's aging face and the way his shoulders had lost a degree of their military squareness. She filed the fact that Rufus Tate had ridden by her fence 3 times in the 2 weeks after Carver's visit and had not stopped, only slowed his eyes moving over the pasture with a professional attentiveness she recognized as the look of a man estimating values. She filed the fact that the county water rights ruling had gone her way and that Osgood had delivered the news in writing rather than in person, which told her something about how he wished to position himself. She was building a picture. The picture was not yet complete, but it was becoming one, and the shape that was emerging was the shape of a confrontation that was going to come whether she prepared for it or not. She prepared for it. News of Carver's visit moved through Granger's Ford the way news of a price always moves fast and with its decimal points intact. Within 2 days, every man in the county knew that a Denver livestock buyer had offered $300 for a single calf sired by the Truitt bull. The mockery that had followed Mabel for 3 months went suddenly completely quiet. It did not become respect. It became something more complicated, a recalibration, the uncomfortable silence of people revising a story they had been confidently telling. 2 days later, Harlan Driscoll came to her cabin door. He did not come on horseback. He came in his good buggy, wearing his visiting coat, his hat in his hands when she opened the door. He had aged since April, not dramatically, but in the way that drought ages a man of property, pulling the flesh tighter over the structures beneath, making the bones of the face more visible. His operation was suffering. Everyone in Callow County knew it because the knowledge of a powerful man's vulnerability travels faster than any other news. "Mabel," he said, and his voice had the warmth of someone who has practiced the warmth. "I've come to say I was wrong." She stood in her doorway. She did not invite him in. "About the calf," he said. "About what I left behind. I underestimated him. I can admit that." He paused. "And I underestimated you. That's something a man doesn't say lightly." He looked at the pasture behind her where Cinder stood in the evening light. "But these are hard times. We've both seen that. And I think that 2 operations working together could accomplish what neither of us can alone. I have the scale. You have the bloodline. Between us." "No," Mabel said. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. Something shifted in his face. The warmth retreated, and what was underneath it had the quality of still water, which can look calm all the way to the point where it drops. "You're being short-sighted," he said. "A woman alone on this land with what you've got, you will not be able to defend it." "I didn't ask for your thoughts on my defensibility," she said. "There are people in this county who have lost everything. Men with families. Men who are looking for someone to blame, and a woman sitting on a green pasture with the only good water for miles is a very visible target." He put his hat back on. "I'm offering you protection as much as partnership." "You're offering me absorption," she said, "and calling it protection." She held his gaze. "I know what happened to my cistern water claim, Mr. Driscoll. The county upheld Section 11. My improvements stand. Something moved across his face. Very fast, not anger exactly. The recalibration of a man who has just discovered that the board he thought was rotted through held his weight after all. That's good news for you, he said, his voice entirely controlled. I wish you well, Mabel. I genuinely do. He went to his buggy. He drove away with the deliberate steadiness of a man who has decided behind his eyes on a course of action and is in no hurry to announce it. Mabel stood at her door and watched him go and felt the cold, particular certainty that this was not over, that it was in fact only now beginning. She began with the documents. She had learned from reading Arvid's legal texts and from watching the county's handling of the water rights dispute that written records were the only form of witness that could not be intimidated, could not be called away at the wrong moment, could not be made to look at its boots when someone powerful stared at it. She spent the first morning writing down everything she could document. Dates, names, what had been said and by whom, the exact measurements of the cistern, basin, the depth of the well before and after the improvements. The date Tate had come to her fence. The date Osgood had delivered the water rights paper. The date the county had sent its ruling. She did not write these things for any immediate purpose. She wrote them because a thing that is written down has a different kind of existence than a thing that is only remembered. And she was one woman without legal standing against a man with lawyers, and the best defense she had was the record. A record is an argument you can make while you are doing something else. The second day she spent on the property itself. She walked every foot of fence line tightening wire and replacing posts where the wood had rotted through. She checked the cistern and topped it from the well, which was a precaution against any tampering during what she suspected was coming. She checked the latch on Cinder's pen twice and then added a secondary chain around the post for good measure. She cleaned and oiled the old rifle Gerald had kept above the mantel, not because she intended to use it, but because the presence of an oiled rifle is a different thing from the presence of a neglected one, and she intended her property to show in every particular that it was watched and maintained and not to be trifled with. She brought Nora into the planning that second evening when Nora came back after her errand in town with the information about Driscoll's meeting. They sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and they talked for 2 hours in the low, precise way of people making a plan that cannot afford to fail. What Mabel proposed was not a defense, but a redirection, the same principle she had applied to the water rights dispute, taking the force of the attack and turning it on itself. If Driscoll wanted to use the town's suffering as a weapon against her, she would remove the weapon by addressing the suffering directly. He'll say you're trying to buy them, Nora said. He'll say whatever he thinks will work, Mabel said. It won't work because they'll see it's not true. The truth has a sound to it. Nora looked at her. You trust that? I've been betting on it for 2 years, Mabel said. It was Nora who brought her the warning 3 days later. She arrived before dawn, her horse lathered her hair loose from its pins. She had been at the mercantile the previous evening, picking up thread, and she had stayed in the back room, looking at bolts of cloth, when Rufus Tate and 2 of the larger cattlemen from the North Range came in and stood by Carlo's counter. She had stayed very still and listened to everything they said. Driscoll was calling a meeting. Not a formal one, not at the town hall. An informal gathering at his ranch to talk about water rights and community resources, and what happens when one person holds what everyone needs. He had been talking to the men whose herds were dying. He had been reminding them that Mabel's pasture was green, that her well was full, that her cattle were growing fat, while their own animals stood on cracked ground and their children drank from barrels. Nora stood in Mabel's kitchen, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and told her all of this. When she finished, the 2 of them sat in a silence that had weight. How long? Mabel said. 2 days, Nora said. Maybe 3. Mabel nodded. She looked at the window where the early light was coming in pale and thin. She thought about Rufus Tate's boot print on her soil. She thought about Osgood's paper. She thought about the 30 men in this county who had lost their herds, who were feeding their families on what was in the cellar and what the chickens produced, who had looked at the sky every morning the way she had and watched it fail them. She thought about what she was going to do. It was not what Driscoll expected. She knew that with the same certainty that she had known the well would go deeper if she dug. She had 2 days to be ready, and she had spent 2 years learning how to use what she had. She began that morning. The morning before they came, Mabel woke before the birds. She lay still in the dark for a moment, taking inventory of herself the way she had learned to do, the way a person learns when they have had enough mornings that felt like the last one. Her hip was quiet. Her hands were stiff from the fence work of the previous week. Her mind was clear, which was the thing that mattered. She got up and went to the table and lit the lamp and sat down with paper and ink. She wrote for an hour, not a letter exactly and not a legal document in the formal sense, though it borrowed the language of both. It was a statement of ownership, of improvement, of intent. It named the date she had brought Cinder home from Driscoll's calving pasture. It named the witnesses Arvid Brandt, who had come the following day, and Owen Calloway, who had been present within the first 2 weeks. It described the well deepening and the cistern construction with dates and measurements. It cited Section 11 of the Kansas Territorial Groundwater Ordinance and the county's ruling in her favor. It stated plainly that Cinder had been observed by Deputy Osgood's own record as not reported missing for 9 days, and that Rufus Tate's visit to her fence on April the 13th had constituted acknowledgement that the animal's location was known. She wrote 3 copies. When Arvid Brandt arrived at first light, which he did because Nora had ridden to him the previous night as well, she had the copies laid out on the table. He read them standing, his hat still on his reading glasses, pushed up onto his forehead. He took the pen she offered and signed all 3 without comment. His signature was the careful, deliberate signature of a man who knows that what he writes with his hand may outlast him. Nora arrived an hour later. She looked at the copies. She looked at Mabel. "What do you want me to do?" she said. "I want you to take one of those to the county recorder's office when it opens," Mabel said. "I want it time-stamped before noon." Nora took the copy, folded it, and put it inside her coat. She did not ask what the other 2 were for. Owen came at his usual time after his father's morning work was done, slipping through the fence with his customary quietness. He looked at Mabel's face and then at Nora's face, and he said, "Is today the day then?" "It might be," Mabel said. He nodded and went to Cinder's pen and began his morning work without another word. Mabel watched him through the window, the 11-year-old boy moving through the morning light with the ease of someone who belongs where he is, and she thought about what she was going to ask him to do and whether it was fair to ask it. She went outside. She stood at the pen fence beside him while he brushed Cinder's back. "Owen," she said, "do you remember the day I brought Cinder home?" "Not that day," he said. "I wasn't here yet, but I remember the day I first saw him. He was about 3 weeks old." "Do you remember seeing Mr. Driscoll ride by later in spring, when he stopped at the fence and looked at Cinder?" Owen was quiet for a moment. His brush kept moving. "I remember," he said. He looked at Cinder a long time. He had his foreman with him, the thin one. "Tate." "Yes, Mr. Driscoll said something to Tate, and Tate wrote something in a little book." Owen looked up at her. Thought it was strange at the time. He wrote it down like it was business. Mabel nodded. "If someone asked you today in front of other people to say what you saw, could you do that?" Owen looked at her steadily. She had noticed over the months the quality of a person who does not perform courage because he does not feel the need to. He simply assessed situations and responded to them. "Yes," he said. The county recorder's office had a clock on the wall above the desk, a large oak-framed clock with a brass pendulum that she had looked at dozens of times over the years without thinking about it. The morning she came in with the statement and laid it on the clerk's desk for time stamping, she looked at that clock as the stamp came down and she noted the time 9:47 in the morning. She was aware with the kind of clarity that important moments sometimes produce that this was a turning point of a specific and documentable kind. Whatever happened after, there would be a piece of paper in the county's official record that said at 9:47 on the morning of the confrontation, Mabel Truitt had filed a legal statement of ownership that predated any counterclaim by more than 18 months. The clock's pendulum swung. The record was made. She thanked the clerk and went outside into the morning air, which smelled of coming fall, and stood for a moment on the steps before getting into her wagon and driving home to wait. They came in the late afternoon when the light was long and the shadows stretched out ahead of them like an announcement. Mabel was on her porch, and she saw them from a distance the way she had watched the storm clouds all summer, with clear eyes and a still face. She had been watching for them. There were 23 men. She counted them as they came up the road. Driscoll was at the front on his bay horse, and Rufus Tate rode beside him. Behind them came men she knew, Silas Pruitt, whose north pasture had gone to dust in June, the Garman brothers who had sold their herd at a loss in July, 4 or 5 men from the smaller homesteads along the creek, and behind all of them, riding slightly apart, Deputy Walt Osgood on his gray gelding with his hands resting on his pommel and his face set into the expression of a man discharging a duty he has assigned himself. Nora was standing at the corner of the cabin where she had positioned herself an hour ago without being asked. Arvid Brandt was sitting on the woodpile to the left of the porch, his hands on his knees, watching the road with the patience of a man who has waited out harder things than this. Owen stood at the pen fence with Cinder behind him, the great black bull watching the approaching crowd with his ears forward and his nostrils working. Mabel came down from the porch and walked to her gate. She stood just inside it, her hands at her sides. Driscoll stopped his horse 10 feet from the gate. The men behind him spread out not in a rush, but in the gradual, instinctive way of people taking positions. She looked at their faces. She had expected an anger, and she found it, but beneath the anger was something that surprised her. Shame. Not in all of them, but in most. The particular shame of men who know they are doing something they would not want described clearly and out loud. "Mabel," Driscoll said, and his voice carried the practiced authority of a man who has spoken to crowds before. "These men have come to talk about what's fair. Their animals are dying. Their families are hurting. You're sitting on water and grass that this whole county needs." "I hear you," Mabel said. Her voice was quieter than his, and it carried just as far. "Mr. Pruitt." Silas Pruitt looked up. He was a big man whose size had always carried a kind of easy confidence, and he did not look confident now. He looked like a man standing in the wreckage of a plan that had seemed better at the beginning. "2 springs ago," Mabel said, "when I was digging my well deeper, you rode by, and you told Gareth Calloway at the smithy that I was wasting my time and my strength on fool's work. Do you remember that?" Pruitt looked at his horse's ears. "Mr. Garman," she said, turning to the older of the 2 brothers, "you told Jed Carlo that my cistern project was the sign of a woman who'd been alone too long and was losing her good sense. He told me so himself." She let that sit for a moment. "I'm not telling you this to embarrass you. I'm telling you because you need to understand what I am and what this place is before you make any decisions about it." She spoke to each man by name. Not all of them, but enough, one clear, specific fact about the thing they had said or done that had dismissed her work and her judgment. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply stated in the tone of a woman reciting the day's weather the record that existed between them. The silence that followed was profound. Deputy Osgood moved his horse forward. He had a paper in his hand. "Mrs. Truitt," he said, "I'm here under an order of county civil inquiry related to the outstanding water rights assessment. Until that matter is resolved in full, I'm authorized to—" "The matter is resolved," Mabel said. She reached inside her coat and produced the second copy of her statement. She walked to the gate and held it out. "The county recorder's office time-stamped a copy of this document at 9:47 this morning. You are welcome to ride in and verify it." Osgood took the paper. He read it. He read it again. His horse shifted under him with the restlessness of an animal waiting to be directed somewhere specific. The direction did not come. Osgood folded the paper once and held it against his saddle without speaking. Driscoll had been watching all of this. His expression had not broken exactly, but it had set in a way that reminded Mabel of the limestone shelf she had hit at 24 feet when deepening her well. Hard all the way through with the heat just underneath. "That document doesn't change what's right," he said. He looked at the men. "These people need water. Their animals are suffering. One woman's legal maneuvering doesn't change the simple human fact of what is needed here." "Mr. Driscoll," Mabel said, and something in her voice made 2 of the men in the front row look at her differently. "You left this animal to die." She did not gesture towards Cinder. She did not need to. Every man there knew what she meant. "You drove away and left him in that field because he was inconvenient. You came to my fence in April and told your foreman to demand him back. You sent your deputy with a legal paper to take my water. You called these men together and rode them down here." She looked at him steadily. "At no point in any of that did you think about what was right. You thought about what was yours." Driscoll's face was iron. "That animal is mine, bred on my property from my stock." "He was abandoned," Mabel said. "Under Kansas law, an animal abandoned and then improved by a third party." "I know the law." "Then you know what it says." She looked past him. She raised her voice only slightly. "Owen?" The boy came from the fence. He walked through the crowd of men who parted for him without thinking the automatic deference adults give to children in moments they cannot quite define. He stopped beside Mabel at the gate. Driscoll looked at the boy. Something flickered in his face. "Owen," Mabel said quietly, "tell these men what you saw the day Mr. Driscoll stopped at our fence, the day he and Mr. Tate rode by." Owen looked up at the crowd. He was 11 years old and he was not afraid of them. He had Gareth Calloway's steadiness and his mother's accurate eyes, and the particular uncomplicated honesty of a child who has not yet learned that truth is sometimes negotiable. "Mr. Driscoll stopped at the fence and looked at Cinder for a long time," Owen said. His voice was clear and caring. "He said something to Mr. Tate, and Mr. Tate wrote it in a book. Then Mr. Driscoll looked at the Cinder again, right at him for maybe half a minute, and then he wrote on." He paused. He knew exactly what Cinder was. He looked at him the way a man looks at something he's already decided to take back. The silence that followed was of a different quality than any silence that had come before it. It had a texture. Several of the men in the crowd were looking at Driscoll, not with the solidarity of men who have ridden to town together, with the measuring, reassessing look of men recalculating. Then from the back of the crowd, where he had been sitting on his own horse with his bag across the saddle, a voice said, "I need to say something." It was Doc Raymond Peel. He had not been part of the crowd when it arrived. He had ridden up quietly sometime in the last 10 minutes and positioned himself at the back, and no one had remarked on it because in a gathering of this kind, the attention was always forward. He rode his horse through the crowd, men moving aside for him as they had moved aside for Owen, and he stopped where they could all see him. "I came to Mabel Truitt's property in April," he said. He was looking at Driscoll. He was not looking at Driscoll the way a man looks at an employer. He was looking at him the way a man looks at something he has decided to put down. "I came because I had heard about the calf and because I am a veterinary professional, and it was my professional responsibility to go." He paused. "I examined the animal, I assessed him, and then I told Mrs. Truitt that I could not support her publicly because of my working relationship with Harlan Driscoll's operation." He looked at the men around him. "I went home. I have thought about that decision every day since." He looked back at Driscoll. That calf's dam was the Scottish Highland import Driscoll brought to this county in 1885. He paid $800 for her, and he reported her death as a respiratory loss. He never reported a surviving calf because a surviving calf from that bloodline would have been publicly documented, and he could not later claim it had died. He stopped. "The animal Mrs. Truitt raised from that field is the most significant breeding specimen in the history of Callow County. She saved him. She has the right to him, and I am sorry that it took me this long to say so out loud." The crowd was very still. Harlan Driscoll sat on his horse. For a moment, he looked simply like a man on a horse, nothing more the authority and the mass of his wealth momentarily invisible. Then he looked at the men around him, and Mabel watched him look, and she could see him reading what was in their faces, and she could see the moment he understood what was there. They were not with him, not because of the legal paper or the boy's testimony or Doc Peel's statement, though all of those had done their work. They were not with him because they were at the end of a long and punishing summer, profoundly tired. Tired of being told what was theirs and what wasn't. Tired of watching their own good judgment lead them to ruin. Tired of following the confidence of a man whose confidence had cost them more than his failure ever had. They were tired in the way that men get tired when they have been proud for too long in the wrong direction. Gareth Calloway pushed his horse forward from the middle of the crowd. He was a broad man, built like his trade, with hands that could bend iron, and a face that spent most of its time in an expression of professional concentration. He looked at Driscoll. "John," he said, and the use of the first name in a public setting was itself a kind of statement. "I think we ought to go home." Driscoll looked at him. "Gareth, I think we came here in anger, and we ought to go home in something better," Gareth said. He looked at Mabel. His expression was not comfortable. It was the expression of a man who knows he owes something and is not sure how to begin paying it. "Mrs. Truitt, my boy has spent the better part of this year on your property learning what decent work looks like. I did not thank you for that. I should have." He paused. "I am thanking you now." He turned his horse around. He rode back through the crowd and onto the road. One by one, beginning with the men nearest him and spreading back through the group the way a fire spreads when the wind shifts, the men turned their horses and followed. Not quickly, not in a rush of enthusiasm. Slowly, with a heavy head-down movement of people going home from something they would rather not have attended. Silas Pruitt was one of the last. He stopped his horse beside Mabel's gate. He looked at her, and then he looked at the ground, and then he looked at her again. "My well went dry in June," he said. "My milk cow is down to a quart a day." "Bring her here," Mabel said. "There's water enough." He nodded once, sharp and brief, the nod of a man who is not going to say thank you because he has not finished being ashamed. He rode away. Deputy Osgood sat on his gray gelding, alone now, except for Driscoll holding the folded paper. He looked at it. He looked at Mabel. "The inquiry is closed," he said, which was as much as he was going to offer, and she accepted it. Driscoll had not moved. He sat on his horse in front of her gate with the expression of a man taking a precise private measurement of a loss. He was not, Mabel thought, a man who would go quietly. He would recalculate and return. But the return would be different. He had played his hand in public, and it had not held, and every man in Callow County now knew that it hadn't. "You think you've won something," he said. "I think the conversation is over for today," she said. He pulled his horse around. He rode away without another word, and Rufus Tate fell in behind him, and Deputy Osgood followed at a distance, and the road was empty. Nora let out a breath from the corner of the cabin that sounded like she had been holding it since noon. Arvid Brandt stood up from the woodpile and put his hat back on and came to stand beside Mabel. Owen was already back at Cinder's pen, his hand on the bull's neck, talking to him in that low, steady murmur. Doc Peel had not left. He sat on his horse at the edge of the yard, looking tired in the way of a man who has resolved something at cost. He dismounted. He tied his horse to the fence post and looked at Mabel. "I owe you a proper examination of that foot," he said. "No charge." "Come in then," she said. The days that followed the confrontation had the quality of a landscape after a storm, the same geography but with everything rearranged. The road past her fence was the same road. The bluestem pasture was the same bluestem. The well casing and the cistern and the pen with the iron latch were exactly as she had left them. But the meaning of each of these things had changed because the story around them had changed, and she was still learning what the new story was. Men came by in ones and twos in the week after, not in a group, not with any collective purpose. Silas Pruitt came with his milk cow as promised, and Mabel showed him where to water the animal and sent him home with a jar of the remaining cistern water for his family's use. He did not speak much. He did not need to. What he had said at the confrontation, or rather, what he had not said, what he had refused to say on Driscoll's behalf, had said everything that needed saying between them. The Garman brothers came separately on different days, which told her something about their current relationship with each other, and each of them found a small excuse to stay for a few minutes to look at the calves, to ask a question about the winter grazing prospects that was not really about the winter grazing prospects. She answered the real questions beneath the surface questions because that was the conversation that was actually happening. What none of them said and what all of them meant was, "We were wrong about you, and we are trying to find a way past it without having to say the words." She found she did not need the words. She had not needed the apology exactly, though the blacksmith's public acknowledgement at the gate had been something she would carry for a long time. What she needed was what she had always needed, which was to be able to work her land and keep her animals and make her own decisions without someone else's judgment sitting on her chest like a stone. That weight had lifted. She could feel its absence the way you feel the absence of a sound you have become so accustomed to that its departure is itself a kind of noise. Doc Peel came by on the Wednesday after the confrontation. Not for the promised examination of Cinder's foot, which had long since healed, but simply to sit on the porch for a while and look at the pasture and say very little. He was a man she understood now who had been carrying his own stone and had put it down in public at significant personal cost and was now learning to move without the weight of it. She made coffee and they sat, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. "He'll find a way to continue," Peel said, meaning Driscoll, after a long quiet. "I know it," she said, "but it will be different." "Yes," she said, "it will be different." She thought about the difference between an enemy who believes he can win and an enemy who knows he cannot. The first kind is more frightening. The second kind is more dangerous in the particular way of cornered things, but also more manageable because a cornered thing is at least predictable. It will try to get out. You know which direction it will go. She was not afraid of Driscoll continuing. She was ready for him to continue in the way that you are ready for a difficulty you have already survived once. The first time a thing tries to break you, it has the advantage of surprise. The second time, you know the shape of it. October came with the particular mercy of a season that has learned to be gentle after its predecessor was not. The mornings were cold, properly cold, the kind of cold that kills the last of the summer's illness and makes the air smell clean. The grass that had come back in September grew dense and dark at the roots before the frost took the top growth, and the cattle that remained on the county's surviving operations came into winter in better condition than anyone had dared to predict in August. Not good condition, survivable condition, which in 1888 was the definition of good. Mabel had kept 12 animals through the summer and came out of it with 9 calves and a bull, and she let herself sit with those numbers for an evening and feel the weight of them, which was not the weight of money exactly, but was the weight of work that had paid, which is a different thing, and in some ways heavier. You can lose money and start again. Work that pays is the evidence that you were right when everyone said you were wrong, and that evidence accumulates in you and changes what you believe is possible. The county held its annual meeting in November, the gathering where the men of the various operations compared notes on the summer's results and made plans that were less plans than conversations, the kind of talking that communities do when they are trying to understand what happened to them and whether they can prevent it from happening again. Mabel had never attended. The meeting had always been men's business in Granger's Ford, which was a convention so established that no one thought to question it, including most of the women who had their own networks of information that operated more efficiently and with less ceremony. She went this year. She did not announce that she was going. She simply arrived at the meeting room above the hardware store, which smelled of sawdust and kerosene and the particular closeness of men who work outdoors and wash infrequently, and she took a seat near the back and settled in. There was a silence when she entered that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which is a long time in a silence. Then Gareth Calloway, who was sitting near the front, turned and looked at her and nodded, and the meeting proceeded. She did not speak much. She had not come to speak. She had come to listen, which was the more valuable skill in her experience. And what she heard was a county in the process of renegotiating its understanding of itself. The men talked about water management with a seriousness that had not been in the conversation the year before. They talked about overgrazing and recovery rates and the underground geology of the county's water supply in terms that suggested some of them had been doing the same kind of reading she had been doing. They talked carefully and without naming him directly about the dangers of monoculture and scale and the single operation dominance that had left the county with no resilience when the dominant operation began to fail. She listened to all of this and recognized in it the particular sound of people who have survived an emergency and are trying to build a structure that will prevent the next one. She had heard this sound in herself 3 years ago after Gerald died. It was the sound of intelligence turning finally and productively toward the actual problem. When the meeting ended, she stood and nodded to the room and left, and on her way out, Silas Pruitt touched her arm and said, "We should talk about water rights this spring." And she said she was available and walked to her wagon in the cold night air and drove home on a road she had driven 10,000 times, which felt for the first time in a long time like the road to somewhere. The rain came in September. It came not dramatically, not with the thunderous performance of a storm announcing itself, but quietly beginning in the night as a sound on the roof that Mabel lay awake listening to for a long time before she trusted it. She got up and went to the door and opened it and stood in the frame and felt the rain on her face steady and cool, carrying the smell of wet earth, which is among the most particular and consoling smells in the world. It rained for 3 days, not hard enough to flood, hard enough to matter. The creek ran again by the second day, a modest, cautious flow. Nothing like the April rush, but real. The grass in the low places began to show green at the roots by the 4th day, the desperate reaching green of things that had survived by going down rather than up. The calves went out to their neighbors in late October when the grass was coming back in the low places and the county had started to breathe again. Hiram Cole came for his with a wagon he had borrowed and a face that had recovered somewhat from its August gauntness. He loaded the bull calf, which was extraordinary Cinder's bone structure in miniature, and drove away with the careful deliberateness of a man transporting something he has finally understood the value of. Mabel watched him go and felt something that was not loss exactly, but was adjacent to it. The calf had been born on her land. She had been there for its first breath. Pete Sutter's boy came for the black heifer with his father's wagon and his father's handshake. which in Callow County was a binding instrument. He was 16 with his father's quiet eyes and his father's habit of speaking less than he knew. He stood at the pen for a while looking at the heifer before he loaded her, and Mabel stood beside him and looked at her too, and they did not discuss what they were both thinking, which was that this animal descended from a cull and a discarded calf was built like something out of a story about what livestock could be. "She'll be a good one," the boy said. "She'll be a great one," Mabel said. She began that month to keep a proper ledger. Not the flower tin arithmetic of survival, the careful counting of coins to see if they stretched. A real ledger with dates and entries and margins for notes, the kind of record a proper operation keeps. The act of keeping it was itself a statement to herself as much as to anyone else that what she was doing was no longer merely staying alive on a piece of marginal land. It was a ranch, the Truett operation. She wrote that at the top of the first page in her careful hand and looked at it for a moment and found it was not strange. It was simply accurate. The Driscoll operations auction that winter was a quieter event than the gossip suggested it would be. Harlan Driscoll did not attend in person, which was perhaps wise. His lawyers managed the proceedings with the brisk efficiency of men who have learned to move past embarrassment by moving quickly. Two of the three northern pastures were bought by a consortium of smaller operators men who had pooled their resources with the kind of practical solidarity that comes from having watched the alternative. The East, holding the best grazing land in the county, went to an outfit from Abilene that none of the locals knew. It was Edmund Carver, making one of his periodic appearances in Callow County, who told Mabel that the Abilene outfit was interested in putting Truett line bulls on their range. He mentioned a figure that required her to sit very still for a moment and look at a point on the wall while her mind adjusted to the scale of it. She told him she would think about it. She thought about it for 3 days, walking her fence line and her pasture and her rebuilt kitchen garden, looking at what she had made with 2 years of mornings. And then she told him yes, with conditions which she laid out in a letter she wrote herself and had Arvid read for accuracy before she sent it. The conditions were simple and non-negotiable. She controlled the animals, she set the terms, she was not a supplier, she was a partner. Carver sent word back that the Abilene outfit had accepted the conditions without amendment. She folded the letter and put it in the flour tin next to the county levy envelope, which was paid. She looked at the two envelopes for a moment, then she went outside to check the water. The valley changed slowly after that. The Driscoll operation did not collapse in a single season, but it diminished steadily the way a fire diminishes when you stop feeding it. By the following spring, 2 of the 3 northern pastures were leased to smaller operators. By the year after, the East holding was sold at county auction. Harlan Driscoll was still in Callow County, still wealthy by the standards of the county, if not by the standards of his own former expectations, but he was smaller. He did not come to Mabel's fence again. Rufus Tate left the county in October, which suited everyone. He went to Nebraska, or so the story went, which had the satisfying quality of a punishment that fits its crime, since Nebraska in 1888 was having its own difficulties with drought, and Tate was the kind of man the land there would recognize and deal with accordingly. Deputy Osgood retained his position, but conducted himself differently, which was the most that could be expected of a man in his situation, and was in its way enough. He stopped riding the road past Mabel's fence on his evening circuits. He started answering her questions at the county office with straight answers and no evasion. It was a small reformation, and it was real. The 3 calves from that first drought summer grew into something remarkable. The heifer Mabel kept, the black one born in the night, with Nora beside her talking homo to the queue in a low, frightened voice, and Mabel directing with steady hands, was the beginning of what people in the county began calling the Truett line. Not because Mabel asked them to call it that, because names attach themselves to things through use, and the use was constant. Every cattleman who took a Truett line calf and watched it grow understood what he had, and he talked about it, and the name spread the way reputations spread in flat country where there is nothing to stop them. Nora Whitfield stayed. She did not stay because she had nowhere else to go, which had been true in July and was less true by October. She stayed because she had found in the work and in the company and in the gradual unannounced friendship with Mabel that had developed through the summer the way useful things develop through pressure and heat and the testing of load-bearing capacity, something she had not expected to find in Callow County at 28 years old. She stayed because the work was real and because Mabel treated her like a person of judgment, which was more than most people had done. By spring, she had built herself a small room off the back of the cabin, a proper room with a window facing east using lumber from a tree that had come down in the September rain. Gareth Calloway had come with Owen one Sunday and helped raise the frame without being asked, working the better part of the day in his steady, wordless way. And when it was done, he had looked at Mabel and said something about Owen's hours that was as close to a formal apology as his nature would permit. Mabel had accepted it without ceremony because ceremony would have embarrassed him, and she did not want him embarrassed. She wanted him back. Gareth Calloway had done more than fix fences that Sunday. He had brought 2 pounds of roofing nails. He said he had surplus, of which Mabel accepted without comment, and a set of door hinges in better condition than the ones on her barn door, which she accepted with thanks. He and Owen had worked for 6 hours, and at the end of the 6 hours, the room had 4 solid walls and a roof that shed water and a door that hung straight and a window frame squared and level ready for the glass that Mabel would order from the hardware store on her next trip to town. It was a room where a person could live with dignity, which was what she had intended, and when Gareth stood back and looked at it, she could see in his face the particular satisfaction of a craftsman who has done work that is right. He said, as he was preparing to leave, that he had been thinking about what Owen was learning. He said it as though continuing a conversation they had already begun, though they had not. He said that a boy who understood animals and land and water, and the patience required to work with all three, had a different kind of education than a boy who understood only iron, and that he was not sure the first kind was worse than the second. He said this looking at the new room rather than at Mabel, because he was the kind of man who could say difficult things more easily when he was looking at something else. Mabel thanked him for the room and for the hinges and for saying what he had said, and he nodded and collected Owen and left. She stood in the empty room for a moment. The evening light came through the window frame and lay across the new floor in a long rectangle, golden and specific, and hers. Outside, the September air smelled of the rain that was still 3 weeks away, but was coming. She could feel it in the particular weight of the sky, the way the light fell differently when water was on its way, softened and refracted by the moisture already moving through the upper air. She went to make supper. The room would be furnished by degrees the way everything worthwhile was furnished, with what could be spared and what could be made, and what was given freely by people who had decided she was worth the giving. Owen came every day until he was no longer coming every day because he was simply there, which is a different thing. He learned cattle from Mabel and from Nora and from Arvid, who came less frequently now as his joints made the walk harder, but who came still and who sat with Mabel on the porch some evenings, in the way of old friends who have earned the right to silence together. Edmund Carver came back from Denver in the spring with 3 buyers, men with city money and the particular hungry attention of people who have heard about something and traveled to see if the hearing was accurate. They walked around Cinder for a long time. They looked at the calves. They spoke to each other in low voices with the tone of people negotiating, and then they came to Mabel and made their offers. She sold 2 calves. The prices were numbers she had not imagined in July of the previous year. She did not sell Cinder. She did not sell Hope the heifer she had kept, who was now confirmed in calf for the 2nd time. What she sold was the beginning of her neighbor's recovery because she priced the calves at what local men could pay and directed Carver's buyers to the animal she held in reserve. And the difference between the 2 prices was the contribution she made to a valley that had needed making. The levy was paid. The well casing was reinforced and capped with a proper cover. The cabin roof was replaced with good cedar shingles that would last 20 years. She bought 4 bred heifers at a price that would have been impossible in the summer and fair by any measure by the fall, and she brought them onto the property in early October. And Cinder moved among them with the grave proprietary dignity of an animal who has understood from the beginning what he is. Arvid Brandt sat with her the evening of the first good frost 2 years and some months after the morning she had slipped through Driscoll's fence with no plan and a conviction she had been too tired and too stubborn to examine. He had brought a bottle of something from the old country that he poured into 2 cups without asking whether she wanted any. They sat on the porch in their coats and watched Cinder move through the pasture, in the last light his black coat catching the low sun and throwing it back the white circle on his forehead luminous. "You know," Arvid said, his voice thick with his accent and his age and the good warmth from the cup, "there is a thing I did not tell you when I first came, when I saw the calf." "What thing?" Mabel said. I had seen the dam, the Scottish cow, at Driscoll's operation in 1885. He showed her to me because he was proud. He wanted to tell someone who would understand. Arvid looked at the cup in his hands. He knew she was special. He paid for that knowledge. He paused. When I saw the calf on your floor, I knew. I knew whose calf it was. I knew what it might become. He looked at her. I did not tell you because I did not want your choices to be about the money. I wanted them to be about the animal. Mabel looked at the pasture. She looked at Cinder. They were about the animal, she said. Yes, Arvid said. That is why I stayed. She had wondered in the months between whether she would feel betrayed by this revelation. She had prepared herself for the feeling in the abstract way she prepared herself for difficulties by considering it clearly and deciding in advance what she would do with it. What she felt sitting on the cold porch with the old man in the darkening pasture was something more complicated than betrayal and less dramatic than forgiveness. It was recognition. She recognized what he had done and why he had done it, and she recognized that the reason was not cowardice or self-protection, but a kind of respect that expressed itself in restraint. He had not wanted to be the person who told her what the calf was worth, because he had understood better than she had at the time that the worth was a burden as much as a gift. If she had known from the beginning that Cinder was the descendant of an $800 Scottish import, that he carried in his bones the genetic inheritance of the best cattle Harlan Driscoll's money could find, she would have approached the work differently. She would have been afraid. Not of failing exactly, but of the scale of what was at stake. She would have managed the fear, and she would have done the work, but the fear would have been in the room with her every morning, a passenger she had not invited. By not telling her, Arvid had given her something that money could not buy, and that fear would have cost her. He had given her the freedom to make decisions based only on what was in front of her, the cold calf on the burlap, the infected foot, the tight wire on the fence line. He had given her the chance to build the operation on the ground rather than in her head. And the operation she had built on the ground was, it turned out, exactly what was needed. Not a monument to potential, a working ranch that would last. She understood all of this sitting on the porch in October, with the first frost coming down, and the man who had quietly made it possible walking away into the dark toward his own 2-mile road home. She would not embarrass him by saying any of it. They were both people who understood that some things are better kept in the understanding than brought out into words where they have to be managed. She watched him until the dark took him. Then she looked at the pasture. He was quiet for a while. The cold came down from the north in slow, invisible waves. The horses in the barn shifted and stamped. From somewhere across the dark fields, a coyote sent up its thin, wavering call and was answered by another farther south. And then both of them went silent. Arvid pulled his coat tighter and looked at his hands, those old hands that had turned German soil into Kansas, soil into something of his own, and Mabel thought about what it meant to have someone who stayed. Not because the situation required it, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they had made the quiet, unannounced decision that this place and this person deserved their staying. He left before dark, walking the 2 miles home, the way he always had, his figure growing small against the wide sky until the distance swallowed him. Mabel sat a while longer. She had spent 20 years in Kansas, which is enough time to learn what the land costs and what it gives back, and what the ratio between those two things looks like over a life. The giving back is always slower than the taking out. This was the fundamental lesson of the place, the thing that the wheat boom men did not understand, and the railroad men did not understand, and the men who arrived with big plans in Eastern capital did not understand. The land is not a bank that returns what you deposit with interest. It is a relationship, and like all relationships, it rewards consistency more than intensity, patience more than ambition, attention more than force. Mabel had not arrived at this understanding through philosophy. She had arrived at it through the specific physical experience of trying to keep a 160-acre piece of marginal land alive through 3 years of diminishing resources and increasing difficulty. The land had taught her what it was, and she had learned, and the learning had produced in ways she could not have anticipated on any of those early mornings, something that the land could not have produced on its own, and that she could not have produced without the land. This was what she thought about sitting in the cold night with the stars coming out, and Cinder moving at the far edge of the pasture when Owen asked why she had not sold the bull. Not the arithmetic of it, not the strategy, the simple bedrock fact of what she and this piece of ground had made together, each working on the other, each changed by the encounter in ways that could not be undone. She had arrived in Callow County as Gerald Truitt's wife, which was a category of position that came with its own expectations and perimeters. Gerald was gone, and the category was gone with him, and what she was now did not have a name that the county had given it. What she was now was Mabel Truitt, which was a thing she had built herself on the materials available. It was not finished. It would not be finished in her lifetime, and that was fine. The not finished part was the interesting part. The not finished part was what Owen would inherit, along with the records and the ledger and the iron latch on the pen gate and the particular knowledge of how the bluestem grows back fastest in the northeast corner after the frost. She would pass these things on to whoever was standing here when she was done, and they would pass them on in their turn, and the line would continue not as a monument to her, but as a working record of what it looks like when you refuse morning after morning to let something die that wants to live. Owen came from the barn where he had been finishing the evening work. He was growing. She could see it in the way his coat fit him now across the shoulders, where a boy's fit and a man's fit are different in ways that happen gradually and then are simply true. He came and leaned on the porch rail and looked at the pasture. "Mrs. Truitt," he said after a time. "Owen, when the Denver buyers were here, and Mr. Carver offered you the price he offered." He turned to look at her. "For Cinder, I mean. The number was—" He stopped. "Why didn't you take it?" She thought about how to answer Tin. She thought about the morning in April 2 years ago, the cold calf on the burlap, the arithmetic of her life, which had been all subtraction. She thought about the cistern water she had given to Prewitt's family through August, and the pails of water she had hauled to the Garman brothers' milk cow. She thought about Nora's room with the east window. She thought about Gareth Calloway raising the frame of that room on a Sunday without being asked. She thought about Arvid Brandt's hands on a dying animal in the lamplight and the recipe from his mother's mother and the $800 secret of a powerful man exposed in the end by the honest observation of an 11-year-old boy. "Because Cinder isn't money," she said. "He never was. He's what happens when you refuse to let something die that wants to live." She looked at the pasture at the great black bull standing in the last of the light. "If I had sold him, I would have had the money and nothing else. What I have now is something I can pass on." Owen was quiet for a moment. "Pass on to who?" he said with the directness of youth. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with his father's forehead and his mother's eyes, and a quality that was entirely his own, the quality of a person who has decided, probably without quite knowing it, where he belongs. "To whoever is standing here when I'm done," she said. He looked at the pasture. He nodded once as if something had been confirmed that he had already suspected. Then he pushed off the rail. "I'll check the water in the morning before you're up," he said. He went inside. Mabel sat in the cold, still air. The stars were coming out above the Kansas grass, the same stars that had looked down on a dying calf and a foolish woman in April of 1887, and they were neither approving nor disapproving, which was the honest truth of stars. What had happened here had happened because of the work and the stubbornness and the willingness to kneel in the mud beside a thing that everyone else had walked away from. The Truitt line would grow. It was already growing. The calves were out there in the dark in the pens and the pastures of a dozen small operations across Callow County, sturdy and black-coated and calm-tempered animals, built not for boom but for the long duration, for the kind of life that the land actually offered, rather than the kind men liked to imagine it did. Cinder moved once at the far end of the pasture, a dark shape in the dark. She could hear him breathing. After 2 years, she still knew the sound. She stayed until the cold got into her bones, and then she went inside where the lamp was still burning, and the cabin smelled of pine resin and coffee, and the particular irreplaceable smell of a place that has been lived in hard and cared for well. She pulled off her boots at the door. She banked the fire for the night. She blew out the lamp. Outside in the Kansas dark, the valley breathed and slept, and began slowly and without drama to become something better than it had been.